Hi, in this video we are going to look at how to make a player jump in a 2D platformer game in Unity only when the player is touching the ground or a platform. So in the previous video we looked at how to make the player jump, but if we go and run this game at the moment, what we'll see is that when we press the space key to make the player jump, we can actually just keep jumping in the air by repeatedly pressing the space key. Okay, so what we're going to do is modify the scene in Unity, and we'll modify the code a little as well so that the player can only jump when they're actually touching something that is considered ground, like a platform or the ground tiles as well. All right, so what we're going to need to do is open up the code. So I've got in my scripts folder, I have the player controller, which is attached to the player object. And in the previous video, we added the code, we added jump speed as a variable, and we added this block of code down here in the update method to check when the key that's mapped to jumping, so the space key, when that's pressed, then we make the player move up on the y-axis. So we're going to need to modify this code a little bit so we can only jump when we're actually touching something that's considered ground. So we're going to add some new variables. So I'm going to go up the top of the code here in the player controller class. I'm going to add 4 new variables. 3 of them will be public variables. So the first one is a public transform. So it's going to start with an uppercase T. Public transform, and I'm going to call this variable ground check. Now, this variable here is basically going to be linked to an empty object in the game, in the scene in Unity. And that empty object is going to be attached to the bottom of the player. So basically at the player's feet. And so it's going to be like a marker that's going to indicate where the player's feet are, so that then we can basically check whether that is near the ground or touching the ground. The next variable is also public, and this is going to be a float. And this is going to be called ground check radius. So this variable is going to be a float or decimal value that's going to be a radius that will be used to draw a circle around the ground check, or around the bottom of the player's feet, to then check whether anything in that area, so basically draw a circle around the player's feet, and in that zone or in that area we're going to check if it's overlapping anything that's considered ground, so a platform or actual ground. All right, and the next variable is a layer mask. So uppercase M, uppercase L, and uppercase M, layer mask, all one word. And this is called ground layer. So in Unity, what we're going to do is use layers to specify what is ground. So things like platform will be put on a layer called ground, and then that will be linked to this code here as well. All right, last variable we'll need, this one can just be private. And this is going to be a Boolean or bool. So it's a variable that can only be true or false. And this one's going to be called is touching ground. So this variable is normally going to be false, but when the conditions match for the player to be touching the ground, it will be changed to true. And when this variable is true, we will allow the player to jump. So none of these variables here need initial values because some of these variables are going to be linked to things in the scene in Unity or specified in the Unity editor. And the is touching ground variable is going to become true or false when we use a function further down in the code. So for now, we'll just leave that as is. We'll add those 4 variables there. We'll go back into the scene in Unity after saving the code. All right. And we'll click on the player object. It's just refreshing, just getting that new code. Click on the player object, and if we go down to where the script is attached, we can see the 3 public variables are there. So ground check radius, and ground layer. Now ground check says none, it's empty at the moment. Ground check radius is just set to 0 because we didn't give it a value in the code, but we're going to change that value here later. And then ground layer at the moment, that's not set either, so that just says nothing. Okay. So the ground check is basically going to be the bottom edge of the player. So if we zoom in here on the player object, it doesn't matter whether this is a character or some other type of object. Whatever we want whatever is going to be the bottom of the player making contact with the ground, that there is going to be called the ground check. We're going to have a little empty object attached to the player in that position right at the bottom of their feet, and it's going to be marked there to indicate where the player is making contact with the ground or touching the ground. So on the player object, we can right click in the hierarchy and click on create empty to add an empty object that's a child of the player object, so it's attached to the player object. I'm going to call it ground check. All right, and click on that object and select the move tool here to move it to the bottom of the player, the bottom edge of the player or the player's feet. And we can actually see here, it's already actually positioned there, but I'm just going to center it a little bit more. Okay, so right there, that is marking the bottom of the player or their feet, and then that ground check radius that we're going to specify is going to be used to just draw a circle around the player's feet. And so when we're jumping, it's going to check, is anything that's considered ground inside that circle, inside that area, overlapping, and if so, let the player jump. So now we've set the ground check position at the player's feet. We can go back to the player object, scroll down to where we see those variables from the code, and where ground check is currently set to none, what we're going to do is set it to be that object there, the ground check we just created, that empty object. So we can actually click and drag in one go. So don't just click on ground check, click and drag in one go. I'm going to drag it down to that box next to ground check, and now that's linked. All right, so this is linked to this. That's set. Okay. Now the next thing to do is to basically we're going to set the ground check radius, which is currently 0. Now this is going to depend, it's going to vary from game to game. It's going to depend on the size of your assets and the size of the player object. So my player object, I actually scaled it down quite a bit before. So we can see the scale is 0.24 when normally the scale of a full-sized object is 1 to begin with. So I scaled it down. So this is going to be quite a small value here, quite a small number, but I'm going to set it to 0.2. If your player object is bigger, then it's going to need to be a bigger number. If your player object is even smaller, then it's probably going to be a smaller number. So you'll just need to experiment with this later when you test out the game to see what works well. But for the size of my player sprite and the size of my scene and everything, the ground check radius is going to be 0.2. Okay. And as I mentioned, that number is going to vary depending on the size of your player. All right, so after specifying the ground check and the ground check radius, now what we need to do is create a layer called ground, and we're going to assign anything in this scene that is considered ground or something that the player can jump off. We're going to assign those objects to that ground layer. So I'm going to start with this platform here because that's what the player lands on when the game begins. I'm going to click on that platform, and over here on the right hand side on the inspector panel we can see layer, and it's currently set to default. If you click on that drop down box, you can click on add layer, and we have some layers that are here by default, but we've got all these empty slots here where we can create our own layers. So in this first empty slot here that's available, I'm going to add a new layer called ground. All right, and so as soon as you type it in, that layer is created. I'm going to click back on that platform again, and now when I choose from the layers list here, I should see that new layer that I just created, ground. So I'm going to click on that, and now this platform is assigned to the ground layer. And so what you'll want to do is then go through your scene and just make sure that you've added all of the other objects that are considered ground to that ground layer. Okay, so any platforms, if you want to be able to jump on things like boxes as well, then they should be on the ground layer, and also your sprites as well. The tiles. If you've used tiles, then they should also be on the ground layer. Okay, so anything that's basically considered ground, anything that we want to be able to jump off should be on the layer ground. I'm only going to do it for this platform at the moment, but later on I am going to add all the other platforms to my ground layer. All right. So at this stage, we can go back to the code. And what we need to do now is go down to the update method, and we're going to need to add a little bit of code here, and we're also going to need to change some code. So in the update method here, what we're going to do is refer to that isTouchingGround variable that we created earlier. And we're going to say isTouchingGround equals, and we're going to use something here called physics2d dot overlap circle. Oops. Okay, so physics2d dot overlap circle, spelled exactly like that, and then some parentheses and a curly bracket at the end of that line. Inside the parentheses here, we add 3 different values separated by commas. The first thing is going to be the position of that ground check object. All right, so if we go back to the game, we click on the player, and we go down to where the script is attached, we can see that ground check is linked to this object over here. Ground check, which its position is at the bottom of the player, or at the player's feet. Okay, so that's the first thing that we're going to specify here in the parentheses is ground check dot position. So we're going to find the position of that object that's marked at the player's feet. Then what we're going to do is refer to the ground check radius. All right, and remember that radius is specified right here. So we haven't actually specified it in the code, but we have specified it in the Unity editor because it's a public variable and we can do that. So it's set to 0.2. All right, now after specifying that here, we're going to add another comma. And the last thing we're going to do is refer to ground layer. Okay, and if we go back to Unity, what we need to remember is, better not forget this, is if we go to that ground layer variable, which is also public, so we can access and modify it here in Unity, what we need to do here is actually specify which is the ground layer. So it's the one that I created earlier called ground. All right, so now that's specified here. And you can actually link multiple layers there, but we've only got one layer called ground, or this, that's going to be used for ground at the moment. So basically ground layer is ground. All right, so that's now linked as well and referred to here. So what this function actually does, what the physics2d.overlap circle function does, is basically it finds the position of the ground check object, which is at the player's feet. It uses the radius that we've specified, which I've specified as 0.2, uses that radius to draw a circle around the player's feet, and then checks if within that circle or that area, if it's overlapping any object that is on the ground layer. And so if they are overlapping, if the player's feet is overlapping or touching something that's considered ground, then the isTouchingGround variable will become true. Otherwise, if the player's not on anything that's ground, then it's going to be false. So the last thing we need to do now is just go down to this if block here where we check if the key that's mapped to jumping is being pressed. If that's true, then basically we make the player be able to jump. But we're going to change this condition here. So not only is the key for jumping, not only does that need to be pressed to be able to jump, but we're also going to say that isTouchingGround needs to be true as well. So what we're going to do here in the condition is add 2 ampersands, which means and. Then we could say isTouchingGround. We could say and isTouchingGround is equal to true, but we can actually just shorten that to isTouchingGround. It means the same thing. All right, so what's happening here is the if statement is checking 2 conditions here. It's checking, are we pressing the button for jump? And also, is touching ground, is that true? If both of those conditions are true, if that all matches, then this line of code will run and the player will be able to jump. So let's save that code and go back to Unity. And Unity is just going to refresh there. It's recognized that the script has been changed and saved. So now we can run this game. And click on play. All right, now the game's running. I can move around. If I press space, I can jump. Now, if I try and press space again while I'm in the air, I can't keep jumping. All right, so I can only jump while I am making contact with the ground. Okay, as soon as I'm in the air, I can't jump in the air like that. All right, and remember at the moment, I've only put this platform here on the ground layer. All right, so that platform's on the ground layer, but these other ones aren't. So at the moment I can jump on this platform, but if I get up to this platform, I can't jump yet. All right, so what I'll need to remember to do is not only have this platform on the ground layer, but also go to my other platforms as well and put those on the ground layer. And if there's anything else that's attached to it, like grass that we want to be able to jump off as well, then when you put that on the ground layer, if it asks if you want to apply that to any children objects, then you can also do that. So I'm going to assign all of these other layers, all of these other platforms to the ground layer later, but let's just go and check that these ones work and we can jump on those platforms. And oops, and that's all working. Okay, now you might notice that you might get stuck on the edge of platforms. So when you're jumping, if you jump and sort of land on the edge of a platform, you might get stuck. We're going to look at how to fix up that little problem in a future video, and then also how to respawn if we fall off the platforms. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.